Hey everyone, how are you doing? Welcome to another video here on the Detroit Lions channel. Today we have some important information that every fan needs to keep up with, so make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any updates. And of course, I want to hear from you in the comments. Type Go Lions and tell me what city and country you're watching from. The season is getting closer and closer, the excitement is building, and Lions fans are already at that point where any piece of Lions news makes our hearts beat faster. In fact, Lions fans are experts at this. All it takes is one update on Twitter and we're already thinking we're going to win the Super Bowl. And 5 minutes later, we're worried about the depth of the roster. But jokes aside, let's get into today's topic because the Detroit Lions just made a move that may look small on the surface, but it actually tells us a lot about what this team is trying to accomplish as training camp continues. Detroit has added cornerback Iko Boy-Doe, giving the secondary another player to evaluate and another body capable of taking meaningful reps during camp. This is not necessarily a move that means the Lions have suddenly found their next starting cornerback, but it is exactly the kind of move a team makes when it wants to create more competition and make sure every practice rep has value. The timing is important because Detroit needs depth in the secondary, and training camp is already dealing with injuries and roster movement. The team has also moved on from other players, including Lauren Strickland, who was waived with an injury. That makes it even more important to have enough healthy players available to maintain the quality of practice. Even with a 90-man roster during this part of the offseason, injuries can quickly reduce the number of players actually available to practice at full speed, and that is why a player like Boy-Doe can be useful even if he does not immediately become a major part of the final roster. He has previous experience, including a short UFL stint and time with the Chiefs, and now he has an opportunity to show the Lions what he can do. Sometimes these additions become much more important than anyone expects. A player can come into camp simply looking for an opportunity, make a few plays, earn the trust of the coaching staff, and suddenly become part of the conversation for a roster spot. But there is another reason this matters. The Lions need defensive backs who can challenge the wide receivers every single day. You cannot have a productive training camp if the offense is constantly getting easy reps because there are not enough healthy defensive backs available. The goal is to create competition, force the receivers to earn every catch, and make sure the offense is being tested throughout camp. Even if a player ultimately does not make the 53-man roster, he can still provide value by helping the team prepare. At the same time, there is another development that deserves even more attention because it involves the offensive line and one of Detroit's most important young players. Blake Miller continues to receive positive attention after his first preseason appearance. The rookie right tackle played the majority of the first half, and there was a lot to evaluate because Cincinnati had many of its starters on the field for at least part of the game. That meant Miller was getting an early taste of what it is like to face NFL-level competition. What made the situation even more interesting was that Miller was dealing with changes around him. He had spent training camp working with the first team, but preseason action brings different circumstances, different communication, and different timing. For an offensive lineman, those details matter. Cadence matters. Communication matters. Knowing the tendencies of the players next to you matters. Miller made 2 mistakes, and those mistakes should not simply be ignored, but the bigger picture is what makes his performance encouraging. Outside of those moments, he was difficult to notice, and for an offensive lineman, that can actually be a very good thing. You want the attention to go somewhere else because the offensive lineman is doing his job. There were positive signs in both areas of his game. Miller showed power as a run blocker, quick feet and pass protection, good overall athleticism, and generally solid hand placement. His size and physical build also stand out. He looks like a natural right tackle, and that matters because Detroit is counting on him to develop into an important piece of this offensive line. Dan Campbell has made it clear that Miller is going to receive a lot of opportunities to develop. The idea is simple. Give the young tackle plenty of reps, let him experience different situations, and allow him to learn from them. One preseason game is not enough to determine exactly what Miller will become, but there is already enough to understand why the Lions are giving him so much work. And Miller is not the only offensive lineman generating interest. Seth McLaughlin is another player worth watching closely. His path to Detroit is especially interesting. McLaughlin was an All-American level center at Alabama before transferring to Ohio State, but an ACL injury interrupted that trajectory. He eventually entered the NFL as an undrafted free agent, and now he is trying to establish himself in Detroit. The challenge for McLaughlin is that he has not had much real game action since that injury. Even though significant time has passed, there is a difference between being medically recovered and having extensive experience playing meaningful football again. His preseason performance did not feature major mistakes, but it also did not produce the kind of dominant performance that immediately demands a starting role. That distinction is important because Detroit is dealing with a major question at center. The Lions have been accustomed to having Frank Ragnow anchoring that position, and replacing that level of consistency is not something that happens automatically. McLaughlin still has time to develop, but based on what was shown in this game, there is reason to believe he is more realistically competing for a depth role right now rather than immediately taking over as the starter. That could still make him valuable to Detroit. If he continues developing, he could potentially become an important backup option in the future. For now though, the Lions need to evaluate him carefully and determine exactly how much he can contribute. Then there is a player who may be quietly becoming one of the most interesting stories in this entire camp, Nick Whiteside. Whiteside has continued to receive strong attention, and Dan Campbell has reportedly been talking positively about the way he is playing. His story is not the typical path of a highly drafted prospect who enters camp with expectations. Whiteside was born and raised in Auburn Hills, went to Saginaw Valley, was picked up by Washington in 2023, spent time with the Battlehawks, and eventually found his way to Detroit. Now, suddenly, he is putting himself into the conversation. The reason this matters so much is the current need for cornerback depth. Detroit needs players who can step up, and Whiteside is showing enough to make people believe that he could be much more than simply another camp body. His previous preseason action gave people a reason to pay attention, and his continued performance in camp is making that attention grow. There is still a lot of football to be played before any final decisions are made, and it would be premature to declare exactly where Whiteside will finish on the depth chart. But the fact that he is generating this kind of conversation is significant. Sometimes a player enters camp with very little outside attention and gradually forces his way into the picture through consistent performance. That is exactly what makes training camp so important. Detroit also received an encouraging development from Jameson Williams, who continues to improve and make his presence felt throughout camp. After a period where there were questions about what to expect from him, the continued progress is a welcome development for the Lions. Williams has been getting better, and seeing that progression during camp is important as Detroit prepares for the regular season. However, not everything coming out of camp is positive. Levi Onwuzurike has suffered a minor setback with an injury, while Ben Bartch is expected to be out for a while after his own setback. Bartch had already been dealing with an issue for much of training camp, so losing him for an extended period creates another complication for an offensive line that is already experimenting with different combinations. One of those experiments involved Tate Ratledge moving to center, with Christian Mahogany shifting to right guard, and Bartch playing left guard. The idea behind the experiment is understandable. Detroit wants to find a way to put its 5 most talented offensive linemen on the field together, but the results did not appear convincing, and there is a strong argument for keeping Ratledge at his natural position rather than constantly moving players around simply to make the pieces fit. The Lions have enough important offensive linemen developing at the same time that continuity could become one of the biggest priorities. Blake Miller is learning, Tate Ratledge is developing, Juice Scruggs remains an important part of the picture, Christian Mahogany is also part of the competition. The more these players work together, the more opportunity they have to build the communication that an offensive line needs. And that becomes even more important because Detroit is preparing to put a significant number of starters on the field in its second preseason game. That decision immediately creates the familiar debate. Should the starters play and gain valuable live repetitions, or should the coaching staff protect them from unnecessary injury risk? There is a legitimate argument on both sides, but because Detroit is not participating in joint practices, live preseason snaps can provide something that regular training camp work cannot completely replicate. Players need to experience real opponents, real pressure, real communication, and situations that cannot always be recreated during practice. For the offensive line in particular, those live repetitions could be extremely valuable. Miller has never played next to every member of the current combination, and the same is true for several of the other young linemen. They need to learn each other's tendencies. They need to communicate naturally. They need to understand how the player beside them reacts when something unexpected happens. That chemistry does not simply appear appear on its own, and with the regular season getting closer, the Lions have to decide how much preparation is enough and how much risk is acceptable. The team knows it needs to be ready when the real games begin, and the opening matchup against the Saints is not a game Detroit can afford to approach without preparation. So now the bigger question is whether these preseason repetitions will help the Lions establish the right combinations before the regular season begins, especially with the offensive line and the secondary still developing. With Blake Miller showing encouraging signs, Nick Whiteside continuing to push for attention, new competition arriving at cornerback, and several players dealing with injuries, there are plenty of decisions coming quickly for Detroit. After everything we are seeing from training camp so far, what do you think is the biggest development right now for the Detroit Lions? The emergence of Nick Whiteside, the progress of Blake Miller, or the questions surrounding the offensive line and cornerback depth?